Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 1 over the human body. It's just a brief orientation. First, let's talk about anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is the study of the structure of body parts and the relationship to one another, whereas physiology is the study of the function of body parts and how they work to carry out life-sustaining activities. Structure definitely dictates function, or we could say that how an organ or organ system looks dictates how it acts or how it functions. So function or physiology depends on structure or anatomy. Anatomy and physiology, therefore, are completely inseparable. The principle of complementarity of structure and function says that function always reflects structure. It's basically referring to the fact that each anatomical structure contains a particular size, shape, location, and that would enable it to perform unique and specific functions. The function is then, therefore, determined by structure, so the function and structure are complementary. And essentially, it's like two sides of a coin. Form follows function. We also want to look at different levels of study. We'll focus first on anatomy. There's gross or macroscopic anatomy, which is looking at large structures. Microscopic anatomy, looking at very small structures. And developmental anatomy, such as the study of structural changes of an individual from fertilization to adulthood. We'll touch on developmental anatomy a couple of times during this course. One example of developmental anatomy is embryology. Gross or macroscopic anatomy would involve looking at things without a microscope, things that are easily observable with the human eye, such as looking at the thoracic cavity, that would be regional anatomy, or looking at the endocrine system, that would be an example of systemic anatomy, or looking at how the skin bulges when you flex a muscle, that would be an example of surface anatomy. Microscopic anatomy would involve the use of a microscope, such as the study of cells, cytology, or studying tissues, which is histology. So here's just an overview of those topics of anatomy. We can see examples of gross or macroscopic anatomy on the left. We have a demonstration of regional anatomy and then systemic anatomy showing all the body systems. The image on the right is showing you different pictures of tissues, so histology, and that would be an example of microscopic anatomy. Topics of physiology often seem to be focused on systems, such as renal physiology focused on the kidneys, or even the entire urinary system. The neurophysiology example here would be focused on sometimes just the central nervous system or the entirety of the nervous system, so that would include the peripheral nervous system. And then cardiovascular physiology would be focused on not only blood vessels, but also the heart. When we say physiology, we're not focusing on what do these structures look like. We're not focusing on where are they located. We're focusing on how do they work? Why do they work the way they do? How do they communicate with other tissues, other systems? That would be the main focus of physiology. Therefore, physiology typically focuses on events at the cellular or molecular level, much more microscopic than the kind of macroscopic or more commonly gross anatomic ideas that we just talked about. We'd also need to consider principles of physics, chemical properties, and even physical properties in our study of physiology. There's also levels of structural organization. The human body is very organized, and we can go from a really small chemical level to a whole organism level. If we start at the bottom, we would want to include the chemical level, which starts with atoms, which combine to make molecules. Molecules come together to form organelles, and organelles are inside single cells. That brings us to the cellular level. When cells come together, they form a tissue. A tissue is just a group of similar cells. When you put different tissues together, you form an organ. You have to have at least two types of tissue, but oftentimes organs contain all four types of tissues. The organ system level includes multiple organs working closely together, such as the heart and blood vessels working together to create the cardiovascular system. And then if we take into account all of the organ systems that allow the human body to run smoothly, we are at the organismal level, where all organ systems combined make a whole organism. So here is a pictograph showing you that structural organization. So we can see if we move from smallest level of structural organization to largest, it would be chemical level, then cellular level, then tissue level, then organ level, then organ system level, and then finally organismal level. So this list here from top to bottom is organized from lowest level of structural organization to highest level. And here's another picture showing you at number 1, the chemical level, where atoms combine to form molecules, and molecules combine to make up organelles, and organelles are in cells, so we're at the cellular level. In this example, we're using smooth muscle, so this smooth muscle cell is demonstrating the cellular level. When these many smooth muscle cells come together, they've created a tissue. When smooth muscle combines with epithelial tissue and connective tissue, that's already 3 tissues. That's plenty of tissues to make an organ, and the organ they've made is a blood vessel. At the organ level, we have many different types of tissues working together to build a structure. If we take into account the heart working with blood vessels, we're actually discussing topics on the organ system level. And organ systems consist of different organs, and then they're just working closely together. And then last but not least, if we were to talk about all the organ systems in the human body, we would be discussing topics on the organismal level, which is what you see at number 6. So I keep saying the different types of tissues or all of the tissues, and let's focus therefore just a little bit more on what a tissue is. The basic definition is tissues are groups of similar cells. There are 4 basic tissue types. There's epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and nervous tissue. Now there's different types of epithelial tissue or types of muscle tissue, types of connective tissue, types of nervous, so on and so on. So these are the 4 basic tissue types. These are our broad categories under which we would find really specific information, which you'll get into when you get to chapter 4. And then a little bit more on organs. Organs are composed of different tissues working together, but we need, again, at least 2 tissue types to consider a structure an organ. Usually organs have all 4, but you must have at least 2 tissue types. Next, let's talk about organ system interrelationships. Organ systems work together. All cells that make up organs, that then make up organ systems, need to work together to meet their survival needs. Organ systems also are trying to make sure that the human body is able to carry out chemical processes in order for life functions to continue. We'd call these processes necessary life functions. And so it's really vital that body functions are parceled out to different organ systems. But even though different organ systems are going to handle different activities, they also need to communicate so that the entire human body, and therefore eventually the nervous system, knows what's going on in the body, and cooperation, communication, and coordination can be achieved with this organ system interrelationship. So first and foremost, let's look at requirements for life. These necessary life functions, such as maintaining boundaries, movement, responsiveness, digestion, even metabolism, excretion, reproduction, and growth. These are going to be your necessary life functions, and we'll look at each one. But here's just a quick list. So first, maintaining boundaries. There needs to be a border, a separation between outside and inside stuffs. So with cells, we need a cell membrane to separate what's inside the cell from what's outside the cell. If we look at the organismal level, we need an integument. We need epithelial layers to separate what's inside an organ or outside an organ, what's outside the human body or inside the human body. And then another necessary life function is movement. Muscle allows for movement, muscle pulling on the skeleton of the body. But also there's going to be movement in and out of cells. So it's not just going to be muscular cells that provide movement for the body. If we look at the cellular level, there's more than just contraction that allows movement in and out of body systems, areas, or movement of the body. There's also responsiveness as a necessary life function, which is a simple ability to sense and respond to stimuli, such as heat stimuli, pressure stimuli, bright light stimuli. There's digestion, which is the breakdown of ingested foodstuffs into tiny bits. Those small bits, called monomers, then could be absorbed in the small intestine. And once they're absorbed in the small intestine, they'll travel into the blood. There's also metabolism, which you see here in red. A good definition for metabolism is all the chemical reactions that occur in the body or in body cells. There's actually two parts to metabolism, which are catabolism and anabolism. Now, catabolism is the breakdown of molecules. It's a breakdown process, whereas anabolism is a synthesis or building process. So both the breakdown and building of substances via chemical reactions in the body would be considered metabolism. There's also excretion, which is the removal of waste from metabolism and digestion. Examples of products that would be excreted are urea, which is breakdown from proteins, carbon dioxide from metabolism, and then feces from the anus, or from the digestive system. What you're seeing here is there's actually three systems that are involved in the removal of waste. And that would be the digestive system, the respiratory system, and the urinary system. All three of those are involved in waste removal. There's also reproduction. There's both cellular and organismal level reproduction. At the cellular level, reproduction involves the division of cells for growth or repair. At the organismal level, reproduction is the production of offspring, or the making of more offspring after fertilization. And then there's growth, which is increase in size of a body part or organism. In order for humans to grow, or their body parts to grow, we actually see the growth of cells. Usually it's a reproduction, then growth of cells. So reproduction and growth go hand in hand. And here is a quick guide to all that information. So it's quite a lot of information. Here we have the 8 necessary life functions laid out for you. Again, maintaining boundaries, responsiveness, metabolism, reproduction, movement, digestion, excretion, and growth. Now, humans are multicellular. Talked about how to build a tissue. We need multiple cells with a similar function. And we need more than just one type of tissue in order for humans to live. So we have plenty of tissues combined to make organs, which build organ systems, and these organ systems are designed to service the cells, to make sure the cells that make up the organs, that make up the tissues, continue living. And all cells depend on organ systems, therefore to meet their survival needs. There are 11 organ systems that work together to maintain life, so we're going to take a look at them. So here are the first 6. You have the integumentary system, which you probably think of as your skin, the skeletal system, which is your bones, muscular system, which includes not only skeletal muscle, which is on your bones, but also smooth and cardiac muscle. We have the nervous system and the endocrine system, both really good coordination and communicating systems for the body, and the cardiovascular system made up of the heart and blood vessels. There's also the lymphatic system, the respiratory system, the digestive system, and the urinary system. 8, 9, and 10 are examples of systems that can excrete or get rid of waste products. And then 11 is the reproductive system. All right, let's go back one. The integumentary system maintains boundaries or provides an external body covering. Not only protective, but it sets up that one necessary life function. The skeletal system, which is really just looking at the bones, is going to be responsible for storing fat, storing minerals, storing things like calcium, for example, but also blood cell formation, which is called hematopoiesis. It also provides muscle attachment for movement. Now, while the muscular system in some books will include all types of muscle, I do want to take a minute here and say that for this part of your chapter 1, the muscular system is just talking about skeletal muscle, which is the muscle that provides movement and posture via contraction, and then also produces heat via leftover chemical reactions. The nervous system, number 4, it involves or is made up of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and it's able to very quickly respond to external and internal stimuli. The endocrine system can also respond to internal and external stimuli. It's responsible for growth, reproduction, and metabolism, and is able to communicate via hormones. Hormones move slower than action potentials. Action potentials were used by the nervous system. So both the nervous and endocrine system, really good communicators, but the nervous system is faster. The cardiovascular system is made up of the heart and blood vessels. So you actually find cardiac muscle over here in number 6, the cardiovascular system. It's a great transport system, and our transport medium is going to be blood, where we will carry oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and waste to the right location. And then if we go on to number 7, we have the lymphatic system, usually also included with the immune system. But the main function of the lymphatic system is actually to return lost fluids to blood vessels so that we maintain good blood pressure and blood volume. But we also see some immune functions like cleansing the blood. The spleen can do that, as well as many lymph nodes. And so immunity, as well as the other functions of the lymphatic system, are included in number 7. Then you have the respiratory system, which keeps blood supplied with oxygen, which travels in the cardiovascular system. The respiratory system is also an excretion system because it removes carbon dioxide. The digestive system removes indigestible foodstuffs. The urinary system removes extra water or electrolytes or any nitrogenous waste, really excess stuffs. And the reproductive system are different for males and females, and the main goal there is to produce offspring. And don't forget that systems are interrelated, they work together. You'll see throughout this course, A&P 1 and 2, that the digestive, cardiovascular, urinary, and respiratory systems work very closely together, exchanging nutrients, ions, and getting rid of waste. Now let's look at our survival needs in a little more detail. They've been mentioned that humans need several factors for survival, but what we didn't mention is that we don't need as much as possible. We need these survival needs in appropriate amounts within a certain range. Too much or too little could be harmful or even deadly. One example of a survival need are nutrients, chemical building blocks for energy, and they include things like what you eat. Carbs, proteins, lipids, which are fats, vitamins, minerals. So those would be examples of nutrients, but you need them in moderation. There's also oxygen, which is required for all chemical reactions, and in order for us to release energy from the food that we eat. But you don't want too much oxygen. That could be disorienting or even deadly. We need water, because 60 to 80% of our body weight is made up of water, but also because all chemical reactions occur in an aqueous environment, or they occur in water. So we need water for chemical reactions to occur in the human body. Also, temperature. We need to maintain a certain heat temperature in the body, and it's important to maintain a stable body temperature of about 37 degrees Celsius. And then atmospheric pressure. In order for your respiratory system to take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide, you have to have the atmospheric pressure within an appropriate range for breathing and gas exchange to take place. Now, we've been talking briefly about maintaining certain substances or certain processes within a certain range. That ability to maintain a relatively stable internal condition within a certain range or within appropriate amounts, that's called homeostasis. Maintaining that stable internal condition, even though the outside world changes continuously, is homeostasis. And it's a dynamic state. It's not a constant, stable state. It's always readjusting depending on what's happening in the human body. But really good examples are what we just looked at. Examples like temperature, nutrients, but also heart rate and excretion. So homeostasis is 100% necessary for the body to function normally and sustain life. And so communication within the body is essential. That means the nervous system, the endocrine system, they're both essential. And homeostatic imbalances would be a disturbance in homeostasis, which normally results in disease. A disturbance of homeostasis, again, increases the risk of disease, but oftentimes the disturbance of homeostasis is just contributed to the process of aging. For example, our heart ages as we age, and so the likelihood of someone heart failure increases as you age, regardless of genetics, although some individuals are at higher risk than others because of both lifestyle and genetics. Other examples, there may be destructive positive feedback mechanisms that take over as we age. One of those was heart failure. And then uncontrolled and unchecked growth of cells is another way to say cancer. And cancer becomes more likely as you age because mutations in the DNA of your cells builds up over time and could cause abnormal cell growth to occur. So let's talk a little more concretely about homeostasis. First and foremost, there's control terms that we need to use in order to talk very precisely about homeostasis. Terms like variables, which are just factors that can change. For example, your blood sugar can go up or down. Your body temperature can go up or down. Blood volume can increase or decrease. And these homeostatic control variables are going to be controlled using three components: a receptor, a control center, and an effector. So you see here in red are the three components of homeostatic control. The receptor is a sensor. It's your input mechanism. It receives the stimulus. It responds. The receptor picks up on a change in the environmental stimuli. So any change in one of those variables that is usually controlled, like blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, any change would then be conveyed to a receptor. And there's different receptors for different types of stimuli. But no matter the receptor, no matter the stimulus, that receptor would then send that information to the control center. The control center for the human body is essentially the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, mostly the brain. The control center analyzes information, determines what is the appropriate response, but the control center also knows what is the ideal condition, what is the range that we would want the amount of this ion, or the heart rate, or blood pressure to be within. Then the control center, once it determines the appropriate response, would send a signal to the effector. And very simply, the effector has an effect. It does something. If blood pressure increased, most likely the effector is going to bring down or decrease blood pressure. The effector is going to be the response or the output to the initial stimulus. And most of the time in the human body, we would use what's called a negative feedback response. And that's the example I just gave. If your heart rate goes up, that would be the stimulus. That would be conveyed to the control center, and the effect would be to bring the heart rate down. In a negative feedback loop, the response to the stimulus would be to reduce it or to do the opposite of what the stimulus was. Or if we were just to continue enhancing the stimulus, for example, if blood pressure went up and we continued to increase blood pressure as our effect or as our response, that's an example of positive feedback. A positive feedback doesn't happen a lot in the human body. Usually it's going to be associated with disease processes like we talked about before. But there are a couple of local positive feedback loops that do work exactly like they're supposed to in the human body, but they're very closely and locally controlled. And we'll look at some examples. So let's talk about the feedback mechanisms in more detail. You have negative feedback, which is going to decrease or shut off a stimulus or reduce intensity. That means whatever happens, we're going to try to do the opposite as our effect. So if our stimulus says this thing goes up, our response is going to be to bring that thing down. So a negative feedback mechanism makes the original stimulus go away. It's going to reduce it, go in the opposite direction. If body temperature goes up, our negative feedback response would be to bring it down. If blood glucose levels drop, our negative feedback response would be to bring it up. If heart rate increases, our negative feedback response would be to bring it down. And now I'm assuming that the increases or decreases we saw as a stimulus were all outside the norm. If increases or decreases are within a normal range, nothing happens. There's no response because we're still in that homeostatic balance. Because a homeostatic balance is a range, not a stable exact one number. Whereas positive feedback is different than negative feedback. Not only because of the name, but also because it doesn't reverse or make that original stimulus go away. Instead, it enhances that original stimulus. It makes that original stimulus exaggerated. The original stimulus, if it increased, would continue to increase even more if we were seeing a positive feedback cycle or loop. An example of this cascade or amplifying effect would be blood clotting or labor. So negative feedback is the most used feedback mechanism in the body. So this would be what we could call, for example, maybe our healthy feedback loop. And it's because the response reduces or shuts off original stimulus. So it does the opposite of whatever the original stimulus is in order to bring us back to a homeostatic level, kind of back to our regular range. Examples: regulation of body temperature, regulation of blood glucose by insulin. Both of those are great examples of negative feedback. Here's a kind of long drawn out example of negative feedback, but it might let you have kind of a better understanding of what's happening with a negative feedback loop, which is one example of homeostatic control. So we're going to use the terms we learned: receptor, control center, effector. So our receptor are going to be cells, and our receptor cells would sense an increase in blood glucose, so that's blood sugar. If our receptor cells sense an increase in blood glucose, then they would communicate to the nerves of the pancreas, that's our control center, and the control center would decide to secrete insulin into the blood. The insulin, this is our effect, it's going to cause body cells to absorb more glucose. And if the glucose goes into cells, it's no longer in the blood. So we just reduced blood glucose. So we did the opposite of our original stimulus. So therefore, we were going to decrease blood glucose levels. If I say that simpler, blood glucose increased in a negative feedback cycle. The response from the effector would be to decrease blood glucose levels. The control center is the neurons that innervate the pancreas. And later in Anatomy and Physiology 2, you'll learn more about the pancreas, more about the endocrine system, and how exactly insulin as a hormone works. Let's look at a more general example. So here we have at number 1, a stimulus produces a change in variable. In this example, the change in variable was an increase. That increase is communicated as the stimulus to the receptor. The receptor at number 2 detects change. The receptor sends an input to a control center, which is generally the nervous system. That input information is sent to the control center, so that means it arrives at the control center. So oftentimes we call that pathway or that route from receptor to control center afferent with an A, the afferent pathway. The control center decides what to do about that input information and then sends out an output signal to an effector. That output signal travels from control center to effector, and that pathway is oftentimes called the efferent pathway, efferent with an E. The effector is going to carry out the response. The response, in this case, because it's a negative feedback loop, would be to reduce the effect of the stimulus and return variables to a homeostatic level. Our initial stimulus showed an increase, so our effector is going to show a decrease. This is a great example for getting the terms and kind of the pathway down for homeostasis. Here's a more specific example of negative feedback. We actually have 2 examples. In one example, we'll start over on the left. We see the stimulus is heat that causes body temperature to rise. Body temperature rising would be picked up by temperature receptors in the skin, some in the brain, then travel via an afferent pathway to the control center, mainly the hypothalamus, which is the thermoregulatory center in the brain. The hypothalamus would decide what to do and send out an output efferent pathway signal. And the effectors for this negative feedback loop are sweat glands. So sweat would start to be produced from the cells that make up sweat glands, causing the evaporation of sweat from the body. And the evaporation of sweat from the body would take heat with it, causing body temperature to fall, and that would reduce the original stimulus, which was body temperature rises. This would cause body temperature to fall. So we see our initial stimulus was body temperature rises. Our final response was body temperature falls. So we have reduced or neutralized the initial stimulus, and that is a negative feedback mechanism. We also have the opposite mechanism. If you're not heating up, maybe you're cooling down. If body temperature falls, you still have skin receptors that talk to the control center that can then send an output signal to effectors. In this case, the effectors are skeletal muscles, and we will initiate, or the body is initiating, minor contractions of skeletal muscle, which would cause shivering. Shivering produces heat, and that excess heat would cause body temperature to rise as it warms up the body. That's also a negative feedback mechanism because our initial stimulus is body temperature falls, and then our response is body temperature rises. We reduced or got rid of the initial stimulus or reversed it. This is a great example to study for negative feedback mechanisms. But now let's look at positive feedback. A little bit harder to understand, but pretty simple, just like negative feedback. But again, negative feedback is one you really want to be familiar with because the body uses that first and foremost. Positive feedback is when we're enhancing or exaggerating the original stimulus. We're not trying to turn it off. We're not trying to turn it around. So a cascade or amplifying effect are great terms to think about when you think of positive feedback. Positive feedback is really infrequent in the human body unless it's associated with disease. There's really only 2 examples I can give for positive feedback that is supposed to occur in the human body. One is in females only, which is the enhancement of labor contractions by oxytocin, and another is platelet plug formation and blood clotting. So let's look at platelet plug formation and blood clotting. At number 1, we see a break or tear that has occurred in a blood vessel wall. This break or tear that occurred in the blood vessel wall is going to expose collagen fibers on the outside of this blood vessel to the inside. And that's going to be a trigger for platelets to adhere to this torn site. So platelets adhere at number 2, and they start to release chemicals. Well, a platelet plug is going to slowly be formed, but it doesn't form all of a sudden. Instead, when the first platelets adhere and release chemicals, that would go on to number 3 and cause more platelets to release chemicals and stick to this tear in the blood vessel wall. And this stick, release chemical, stick, release chemical, stick, release chemical process would continue until there was a full plug at the tear in this blood vessel. Once the plug is formed and collagen from the outside is no longer exposed to the inside, the initial stimulus or trigger for platelet plug formation is gone. So this is a great example of positive feedback because we can easily see what is the initial stimulus. We can see how other platelets are going to influence more platelets. And we can see that once the initial stimulus is gone, how this feedback system shuts down. So it won't continue to cause clotting or platelet sticking or aggregation throughout the entire cardiovascular system. In the human body, we also want to maintain homeostasis because the body communicates through neural and hormonal control systems. We commonly use, since we're using neural and hormonal systems as our communicators, we commonly are going to use these receptors, control centers, and effectors in order to coordinate things in the body, to regulate events or factors that are out of balance with the acceptable range of internal body conditions. And your body does this throughout the day. It doesn't just sometimes do this. It's constantly adjusting things in your body in order to maintain the appropriate levels of things like ions, temperature, heart rate, blood volume, even blood sugar. Our next section is going to be mostly over some terminology. We're going to be looking at the language of anatomy. So we'll look at anatomical terms, body planes, cavities, and membranes. So make sure to look for part 2 of the Chapter 1 video lecture.